Now turning to our program. I am pleased to welcome James Madlam, Chief Executive Officer of Miller Communications, to introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon, fellow Rotarians. What a wonderful, educational, inspirational set of messages we've already had this morning. And it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker to continue that. Dan Haumschild earned his PhD in comparative literature from the University of Buffalo. He focuses research on the relationship between public history, education, and political agency, particularly in communities that had experienced mass atrocities. Since then, Dan has dedicated himself to creating meaningful educational experiences that invite people in to a stronger relationship with the past, with one another, and with themselves. Currently, he works as the Director of Education at the Jewish Museum of Milwaukee. He is also a Senior Fellow and Professor at the Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Yeshiva University. Today, he will be presenting on Hitler's War on Modern Art, a presentation that is connected with an exhibit that is currently ongoing at the Jewish Museum of Milwaukee, right on Prospect Avenue. And because we were able to move this further forward, it gives you even more time to be able to go out and to see this really incredible exhibit. So please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Dan.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you to the Rotary Club for having me and for inviting me to make this switch. I apologize for those of you who wanted to see the mayor. I am decidedly not the mayor. But what I'm going to talk about hopefully will be of interest to you nonetheless. I'm very, very excited to be here as a representative of Jewish Museum Milwaukee. Our goal at the museum is to build bridges between diverse communities using shared histories and to reflect on current issues by reflecting on the past, by bringing the past to bear on the present, which is wonderful because that's what I got my PhD in. So the current exhibit that we have up is called DEGENERATE. And what I'm going to do is provide a little bit of an insight into how I read this exhibit. So I'm not going to really present to you the exhibit because this is the teaser, right? You're supposed to go look at it yourself. But hopefully what this will do is provide for you some kind of avenue of entry, some sort of opportunity for you to see the museum and this particular exhibit in one particular way, in one way that I see it, that might be of help to you. So I've named this title, this talk, A Culture of Violence, Nazism, Art, and Life Unworthy of Life. I'm going to start, though, from what most everybody knows about the Holocaust. Most everybody's aware of the Holocaust being this wretched, horrendous moment in history that caused the destruction of life. 6 million Jewish people and millions of other people lost their lives as a result of the violence of the Nazi party, the Third Reich, as they called themselves. And many people are familiar with this sign, which hangs above the gates of Auschwitz. Does anybody know what it says? I'm hearing it. Yeah, work makes you free. Anybody have an interpretation of what that means? What does that mean, work makes you free? In this context. No volunteers? Sorry for the pop quiz. Many people interpret it as what the people who are incarcerated in this space are doing, right? They're often in a place like Auschwitz-Birkenau. It's both a extermination camp and a slave labor camp. So people read this as a cynical way of saying, come in here, do some work, and you will eventually be set free, right? Of course, the freedom that people often achieved through the gates of Auschwitz didn't come in their lifetime. It came in the form of death. My interpretation of it is different. Because this is actually in a camp that's in Poland, as were all the death camps, and many of them have Arbeit macht frei over the gates. Arbeit macht frei is not a Polish phrase, it's a German phrase. The people who were going in and out of this gate every day were not the prisoners. They were being shipped in on cattle cars. They couldn't see anything as they were going into this camp. They almost never had a chance to leave the camp and see this work will set you free. It's the people who were working in the camp that saw this every day. The people who were going to work every day, but that work had transformed to mean the act of mass murder. That's my interpretation of this. For them, the work that they were doing to set them free was to be free of the tyranny of Jewish Bolshevism, right? Or some other element of the conspiracy theory that kind of fueled Nazi fascism, Nazi fanaticism, right? They were going to work every day, and that work was the act of killing thousands of people. At its height, Auschwitz processed, which is to say killed, 6,000 people per day. That was the work that the German people thought was setting them free. So my question, as always, this is kind of the question I've been asking myself for 20 years. How did the Third Reich shift the culture so drastically that work became synonymous with killing human beings? So, if we step back a little bit, we'll move from Auschwitz, which was decided upon, the final solution was decided upon at a conference in 1942 at Wannsee. We'll step back a couple of years to Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht is the Night of the Broken Glass, which is a very famous pogrom. A pogrom is essentially a riot that is organized by the police against a civilian population, against a victim that is a civilian primarily. In between those 4 years, from 1938 to 1942, there was the invasion of Poland, the start of World War II, the use of mobile killing squads, which are these forces of essentially the SS that would move into various areas of Poland that the Germans had conquered and just shoot people into ravines. And then a whole bunch of other atrocities that are too many to name. But what I'd like to talk about here is previous to Kristallnacht and see if maybe this culture had already taken root. To do so, I'm going to introduce you to Alfons Heck, who was himself a Hitler youth.
You had become invincible. After my return from Nuremberg, life in the town seemed quite boring. But all of a sudden, on November the 9th, 1938, excitement broke loose. It was the Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. It seemed like a frenzy of hatred all of a sudden. As we were crossing the marketplace, a van stopped, and there were perhaps 18, at the most 20 people on it. One of them was shouting, "Let's get to the synagogue and take it apart." Literally seconds later, the stained glass window came crashing into the road. And a few minutes later, one of the stormtroopers was up on the roof, and he released the rolls of the Torah. And he was shouting, "Wipe your asses with it." Even to me, as a 10-year-old, the events of the Kristallnacht, my witnessing the brutality committed on townspeople that I had known all of my life, signified the end of German innocence. From now on, not one of us could ever maintain that we did not know what was in store for the Jews. By the fall of 1940, the first deportations of the Jews of Germany began.
Okay, so that is a testimony of Alfons Heck, who was a Hitler youth in his day. And I bring that up because I want to know, is Kristallnacht, if we go back to 1938, is that far enough back that things could have changed, that the culture of the German Republic had not yet been crystallized into something that made work synonymous with this sort of violence? According to Heck, though, it doesn't seem so. He says, as you might recall, even to me as a 10-year-old, the events of the Kristallnacht, my witnessing the brutality committed on townspeople that I had known all of my life, signified the end of German innocence. From now on, not one of us could ever maintain that we did not know what was in store for the Jews. So, in other words, and this has also been shown by many other scholars, that by November of 1938, kind of the mold was set. Things were prepared. Everybody was ready to go. In fact, the broad, sweeping, popular response to Kristallnacht was not, that was unjust, that was incredibly horrible, please don't do that to these innocent human beings. The general public response was, that was kind of messy. That was a bit loud. Could you keep it down? That was it. Right? So by 1938, the die was cast. So let's step back a little bit further. If we go 57 years before Kristallnacht, that's a bit of a leap, but we're going to walk back toward Kristallnacht progressively. We have Cesar Lombroso, who discovered the abnormality of skulls, of a particular skull of a criminal named Giuseppe Vieja, a notorious Calabrian thief. And he started to postulate that people are born criminals. He believed that criminality was actually something that was inherited, and that these sorts of different things could be discussed about or discovered about people's physical phenotype that would allow them to be ascertained as an inherently criminal person. This is the dawn of the eugenics movement. Of course, the eugenics movement is an attempt to not only create what the Nazis would later call like the Übermensch, or the Aryan people, the great ones, so to speak, but also to weed out those people who were detrimental to society. Cesar Lombroso is one of the first people to imagine what this might look like. Then, 46 years before Kristallnacht, there's a social critic and physician named Max Nordau who publishes this book called Entartung, or Degeneration. Here he argues that the negative effects of degeneracy are broader. It's not just about a single individual, but that the existence of those individuals and multiple individuals end up sucking the life out of a social group of people. He also states that modern art, this is where art and eugenics start to meld with one another. He says that the work, modern art is the work of those that are so corrupted and enfeebled by modern life that they have lost the self-control needed to make coherent works. And so he starts assessing people's psychological capacity and their actual health in terms of their psychological health based on the work that they're making. I don't know about anybody in here who's an artist who has ever dabbled in art, but I don't ever really want anybody to judge my psychological capacity or psychological health based on the work that I've made. I once thought that my voice was very similar to Michael Bublé, for example. So I recorded myself singing some Michael Bublé songs. I had to burn the computer because I was so embarrassed about what I had created. But if those files still existed, right, and I was judged based on, this guy thinks he sounds like Michael Bublé, right, I would definitely fall into the category of a degenerate, according to this, right? I certainly do not sound like Michael Bublé. So ultimately, these statements about modern artists' reflections on the world, these were not stated with sympathy. This was a condemnation of people who weren't strong enough and viable enough to deal with the modern world and needed to be slowly moved out of the center. And then we move to 10 years before Kristallnacht. Paul Schütze-Naumburg publishes a book called Art and Race, Kunst und Race. And he consolidates the concepts of both Lombroso and Nordau and emphasizes the need for purity and hygiene in all aspects of social, political, and cultural life. This is where eugenics reaches, in some ways, its apex. It's not just about creating a stronger breed of people, it's about creating a stronger socio-cultural, biological group of people, a nation, really, that can uphold the ethos of whatever group is in power. He also sees degeneracy as a mental illness that is exposed through one's creative expression, and he advocates for criminalizing degeneracy and responding with both imprisonment and institutionalization. So he's suggesting that people who paint certain works of art that reflect some sort of, let's say, schizophrenic tendency or something like that, should actually be institutionalized as having schizophrenia. So he's suggesting that we diagnose people through their art. And so since those who are institutionalized can neither work on behalf of the state nor conform to its demands, he coins this term, life unworthy of life. He starts denoting people as having life unworthy of life. Not just the mentally ill, not just those who have physical handicaps, not just those who are considered to be, psychologically disturbed, so to speak, but anybody who doesn't fit into the social, political, and cultural life of the people in charge are now starting to be described as life unworthy of life by Paul Schulze in Naumburg. And then 5 years before Kristallnacht, we have Adolf Hitler, who's instated as the German Chancellor. 10 years before that, of course, he tries to overthrow the government in the beer hall putsch, but apparently you can be put in jail for treason and then 10 years later become the president. I don't exactly know how that works. But as the chancellor, he sees himself as an artist. Many of you know that Adolf Hitler wanted to be an artist. He actually applied to the Vienna Art School twice, in 1907 and 1908, and he was rejected both times because his art really wasn't in fitting with modernist art styles. He was really a realist painter. He actually made a living for many of his adolescent years as a painter of like postcards and things like that. And really, his work kind of belongs in a Holiday Inn, right? Like that's about where the apex of his artistic creativity was. But he still saw himself as an artist when he came to power, and people also saw him as an artist. This is a cartoon that was created by Oscar Garvins in 1933 called The Sculptor of Germany. And if we look at it closely, we can see some pretty interesting things here. First of all, we have the artist who's identified in this portrayal. This artist would be somebody who falls into the category of degeneracy that we just talked about. Somebody that Lombroso or Nordau or Paul Schulze in Naumburg might have diagnosed as having some sort of ailment that allows them to make art that is completely uncategorically awful, according to the Fuhrer. And the artist here is portrayed with a bit of anti-Semitic propaganda, and ultimately, as you'll see in the third and fourth boxes there, is dismissed entirely. We also have their art, which is the product of a dismissible people. According to Nazism, if somebody themselves was degenerate, like following the rubric that was created by somebody like Paul Schulze in Naumburg, it was impossible for them to make German art. The only art that they could possibly make was art that was considered un-German. So the artwork should be destroyed and dismissed just as quickly as the artists themselves. And then the real work begins. The Fuhrer kind of shows us the way here, right? The Fuhrer does the work of smashing the remnants of the artist's influence. The artist is dismissed, and then their artwork is also destroyed. And then he refolds the clay into a workable clump, something that he himself can then ultimately transform into some image that reflects the perfect or ideal German. This is the work that the Fuhrer is doing, getting rid of the undesirables, getting rid of their cultural influence, and then ultimately sculpting German society into something admirable, into something ideal. The Nazis saw a direct relationship between art and the artists, as I mentioned before. People who they deemed un-German couldn't possibly create German art, but people who created un-German art were then equally considered to be not German. So it was this kind of cycle of negation. Now, if we think about this and the way that this ultimately translates, we can see it play out in a couple of different ways. As I mentioned, the artist Fuhrer kind of leads the way, showing what the process of good work is. The first step is to destroy the degenerate, like this. Then secondly, you need to recreate German greatness. So this is what work actually looks like by 1933 even. Destroy the degenerate and recreate German greatness. Then a year before Kristallnacht, the Degenerate Art exhibit opens in Munich. This is what our exhibit is about. On the left-hand side of the images that you see up on the screen is a poster for the Entartet Kunst exhibit, which actually is taking place. This one is for the Berlin exhibit. The Entartet Kunst exhibit is, Entartet Kunst means degenerate art. Our exhibit title is Degenerate, Hitler's War on Modern Art. What they're doing here is they gather they gather between 20 and 23,000 works of art from national galleries all over Europe, and they select quite a number to go into a degenerate art exhibit as an opportunity to shame, mock, and ultimately kind of say adieu to all this art that has populated Germany over the last 20 years. German Expressionism is kind of the primary target of their agenda. German Expressionism flourishes during the Weimar period, which happens between World War I and 1933. But Hitler does not see this as a proper German art form, but rather as a sign of Germans' degeneracy and their fall from grace. So he showcases a whole bunch of art called Entartet Kunst, degenerate art, and adjacent, just down the street, a day before, opens the Great German Art Exhibit. The Great German Art Exhibit showcases art that was considered to be proper, that was upstanding, that was aligned with the Nazi ideology in one way or another. It wasn't necessarily propaganda, but it was the kind of art that the Nazis really adored and admired and wanted to promote. Interestingly, though, of these two exhibits ran simultaneous to one another, and about 500,000 people went to see the Great German Art Exhibit, which is a lot. That's a lot of people to go to any art exhibit. If JMM got 500,000 people to see our exhibit, we'd be really excited. So tell your friends. And tell your enemies, in fact. We want everybody to come. But the Entartet Kunst exhibits saw 2 million people come through its doors as it traveled around. There's a number of reasons for this, right? Number one is that it was considered X-rated. Even people under 18 weren't allowed to go. So that automatically creates some sort of intrigue. Secondly, people knew that this art was kind of on its way out, so they maybe wanted to see it before it left because, as I mentioned, German Expressionism was incredibly popular and really a genuine German art form that many people adored. And finally, people just wanted to go because they thought that they were doing something a little bit taboo, right? They wanted to go to this event because they thought, this is a little bit scandalous, right? They wanted to live on the wild side and go see this art that was considered degenerate. But some people will argue just simply that degenerate art is actually interesting art. For example, here are two pieces. One that was featured in the the works of German greatness. On the right, we have Deutsche Frau by Wolfgang Willrich, who actually himself was a SS officer in charge of creating the Great German Art Exhibit, one of the people in charge of creating the Great German Art Exhibit. And this piece on the right would have been considered Great German Art, whereas the piece on the left, which you can see if you come to our exhibit, would have been considered degenerate. Thankfully, this piece was not seized by the Nazis because what the Nazis did with most art that they seized was show it for shame in these kinds of exhibits like degenerate art. They would sell it on the black market to support their war effort, and many of those pieces ended up in America through the sale of these pieces on the black market. Or they would be stashed away and hidden, and ultimately, most of the work that they seized was burned. Thankfully, Katzi Kollwitz's Death Seizes a Woman was not. Somehow it survived, somehow it made its way to southeastern Wisconsin, and now it is currently on the walls of our exhibit. The reason that these two things might have been considered degenerate, the reason that Katzi Kollwitz's piece might have been considered degenerate is partly because the Nazis never really wanted to talk about death. Which is interesting because, as I mentioned at the beginning, they caused a lot of death. Right? 6 million Jewish people were murdered at the hands of the Nazis, but they never wanted to talk about it. Right? They wanted to keep all that quite hush-hush. And certainly they didn't want death to be associated with women. Women are supposed to be the conduits of life, particularly Aryan life, blonde-haired, blue-eyed life, right? So death being associated with a woman is a double no-no, right? So on the left-hand side, we have art that is considered degenerate, and on the right-hand side, we have art that is considered great. One should be destroyed, and another should be celebrated. This also translated into other kinds of work. On the left-hand side here, we have a poster that is advertising, essentially, that is supporting or suggesting that the care for the mentally ill is costing the German taxpayer 60,000 Reichsmarks over the course of that person's lifetime. And that this money is rightfully owed back to the German people for taking care of somebody who cannot work on behalf of the German community. And in fact, that all the workers of the German Republic are paying for this person to exist, and that is not appropriate anymore. Because the work that people should be doing is featured here on the right. Workers of the mind and heart vote for the front soldier Hitler. And you see these strapping young men carrying some ungodly large hammer that I could never even pick up, wearing a baseball cap and their blonde hair slicked back nicely. On the right-hand side, we see an obvious picture of what work looks like. And on the left-hand side, we see a picture of the degeneracy that is sapping the life out of the workers of the world, right? One should be destroyed, the other should be celebrated. This brings me to Elfriede Wachter. This is a piece that you'll find in our exhibit, and we're very, very happy that we have it. Elfriede Wachter was a wonderful artist who was born in Dresden in 1899, and her paintings often depict women in ways that were thought un-German. Perhaps because Germans really thought women were really good for, predominantly, as I mentioned before, making Aryan babies. So women who have a look of power and self-assertion, as this woman does. This woman's also smoking a cigarette, which is sort of cut off by the fade there. This woman does not necessarily seem to be capitulating to the whims of men. Of course, a fascist regime is quite often hypermasculine. So the promotion of women's independence is not something that the Nazis would have seen as admirable. In 1929, though, Elfriede Wachter was hospitalized for various mental illnesses. And in 1932, she actually was diagnosed with schizophrenia. So when Hitler came to power, she was one of those people in a mental health care institution and would have, by virtue of the concept of racial hygiene and so on and so forth that I mentioned at the beginning, been considered to be a degenerate person. So all the work that she had ever made and all the work that she would make between 1932 and 1935 in the mental health care institution where she was living was seized and destroyed. Some of her paintings survived, including this little piece that we have in our exhibit that was painted in 1931, right before she went into the hospital for the last time. In 1935, she was forcibly sterilized, which was a program that the Nazis initiated at that time to make sure that people like Elfriede Wachter could not be part of the gene pool anymore. And then in 1940, she was transferred to a former psychiatric institution at Pirna-Sonnenstein. And on the 31st of July, she was murdered there as part of the Action T4 program. This was the euthanasia program that was created for taking out the mentally unwell. It ultimately cost the lives of anywhere between 250 and 350,000 people who were deemed life unworthy of life, and whose job it was, who the German people saw as it was their job to take those people out of the gene pool, to take them out of not only the gene pool, but also out of the culture, out of the political schema, and out of the wallets, the pocketbooks of the German people who were working for the benefit of making Germany great once more. Her artwork was seen ultimately as a threat to the culture that Hitler was working for. And so her artwork was initially seized and burned. Her mental health was a threat to the purity and hygiene of the German people, so she was taken out of the gene pool by virtue of her forced sterilization in 1935. And then her inability to work on behalf of the Reich was a threat to the Nazi project, so her very existence became life unworthy of life, and she herself was murdered. It was her life categorized in this way, as life unworthy of life, that the German people learned to work against. This work became the omniscient feature of what it meant to be a Nazi, of what it meant ultimately to be a good German. And it's this kind of work that I see as being represented in our exhibit. What we do is try to celebrate the work of people like Elfriede Wachter. We hang their work on our walls as an act of defiance to the Nazis. And we invite you to come in and celebrate it along with us as an act of defiance to fascism all over the world, and to the continuance of this sort of behavior that we see emerging in the world today. We invite you to our space to have that sort of an experience, because we really want to avoid falling into the trap that allows us to conflate work or being a good American with what we ultimately know happened in Germany. Thank you for sharing this space with me today. I believe there's some time for questions if anybody has them.
I came here to see the mayor, but I'm delighted that I had a chance to hear you, so thank you. My name is Joe Milner. There's a couple of things that came to mind. I think I have two questions, but a couple of things that came to mind. In your introduction, you said that you were a political, I can't think of the word, political agency you used. I don't know what that means. I'd like to know a little bit more about this.
Sure.
The other thing is there's a lot of discussion around critical race theory. And there's a movement afoot to make sure that this discussion around especially the African American culture, is not proliferated in a way that creates, emotional dissension. Maybe I'm making stuff up here, right? In light of what you shared with us today, I'm just interested in your perspective.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that question, and thanks for coming anyway. Yeah, I figured the swap was not going to be all that savory to some people, but I hope the bait and switch was enjoyable. Political agency, I would say, is basically the opportunity that people have to decide for themselves who they are going to be in the world and how they are going to be seen, right? And I think that something like critical race theory, when used appropriately, my understanding of critical race theory, I think, is different from the way that critical race theory is talked about in popular culture. And I think that the way that it is being admonished is also quite ridiculous. Although I see the application of it occasionally falling into that trap. But I think that critical race theory is actually an opportunity for people to understand their own political agency as a direct result of what it is that they have inherited. Right? For me, critical race theory, when done correctly, is an opportunity for all of us to understand not so that we can use history in a way that does not essentially confirm who we are, but calls into question who we are. That calls into question who we are as a result of where we're from and what it is that we have inherited, ultimately, right? So when we use critical race theory correctly, that's something that I think we can do. And when we understand who we are and where we fit into the world, how it is that we've inherited whatever we've inherited, then we can also make more conscientious decisions about how we want to participate in the world hereafter, right? I think that follows alongside the four-way test, right, that the Rotarians are all about. By understanding who we are in the world, we can make a better decision about how we want to participate in the world hereafter. And I think that really is what I mean when I say something like political agency. But of course, political agency can ebb and flow depending upon who's in charge, and who's given political agency depends on how we define, I guess, civilians at one stage or another. Thank you for that question. I hope I answered it.
Thank you for your talk. Very moving, and it caused me to remember when I visited Germany and some of the scenes and that you depicted. You used the term fascism on a couple of occasions, and you talked about artists, in this case, the artwork. Of course, comedy is art, music is art, etc. And you also talked about fascism in the context of white males and skinheads, etc. Observing where we are in America today and looking back at the timeline that you created for the tragedy, the crimes of Germany, do you have any thoughts on where we are in terms of, on one hand, the skinhead fascist culture of the right in some instances, and the cancel culture on the left?
Sure. Thank you for that question. It's a really important question that I think, is prompted by our exhibit. We're not really prompting that question in our exhibit, interestingly. We chose not to, but we also didn't need to, because everybody who comes to our exhibit has this exact same question, right? Where are we in terms of our relationship to this past? And I think that my answer is that when I talk about a culture of violence, I'm also talking about, as a precursor to a culture of violence, we have to talk about a culture of intolerance. And I think cultures of intolerance feed one another. They're this reverberating loop. It's like putting two speakers adjacent to one another, pointing at each other. I don't know if anybody's ever done that before, but you play a sound out of one, it plays into the other, and then like reverberates back and forth into one another, and it just creates this incredible cacophony of horrible sound, right? And I think when we think about something like cancel culture on one hand or fascism on the other hand, we are talking about two cultures of intolerance that are being birthed out of maybe two different entities, right, that see themselves as on opposite sides of the political spectrum, but are ultimately playing the same game in certain ways, right? And that game that I'm thinking about is particularly intolerance, right? So when we see people who are radically intolerant of people on the other side of the political spectrum, whether they are on the left or the right, that culture of intolerance feeds the intolerance of others, right? So it's really important for, I think, every one of us to use our political agency to reflect back on that question, to understand where it is that maybe those people are coming from over there who are seemingly intolerant of us, as a way of understanding how it is that we can respond to them in a compassionate way and break through that barrier of intolerance and allow them to see us as a human by first seeing them as a human, right? So on either side of the spectrum, I think intolerance is growing, and it's our job as a society, as a culture, as a people to work against that, and I think most importantly, to do some really hard reflecting in the mirror first and foremost about where are my intolerances, which I can tell you every time I get cut off on the highway, whew, right? It's living in all of us, right? We just have to find ways to reflect on it very, very critically. So thank you so much for that question. It's too big to answer here, but I would love to talk to you later.
Good afternoon. On my 21st birthday, I toured Auschwitz-Birkenau. I studied at Jagiellonian University in Krakow. And at 21, it changed my life. I'm not Jewish. Doesn't matter, because that's an educational piece that we all need to go through. I want to compliment you and thank you for this exhibit, because the continued education of what occurred 75 plus years ago, 80 years ago, needs to be told, needs to be taught, especially through the eyes, of course, of the art and the translation. It eventually led to me interviewing, and my senior thesis were survivors of concentration camps. And it was the most depressing year of my life as a young college student, but it changed my life. And keep up the good work, because you need to do this. We all need to do this with you, but thank you so much. It's more of a compliment, and keep up the fight.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I remember there was a kind of a mantra after World War II and the Holocaust that was kind of like never again. Yet we see there are so many countries in the world where there is either ethnic cleansing, re-education camps, apartheid policies, so many different efforts to squash one particular ethnicity, religion, whatever it is. I just want to hear your thoughts on that, and if you see that this is a kind of replica of the first steps that took place prior to the Holocaust.
Thank you so much for that question, and that's really what my dissertation is about, so I'm not going to get into all of that, but I'm really concerned about the relationship that we often easily make between knowledge and changing the future, right? We say like, learn about the past to build a brighter future, but that's not really how it works, right? Because the humanitarian crises of the past are not a computational problem. They're a human problem. If it was just about knowing about the past, we'd all be fine, right? Because we all have Google in our pockets at all times, right? We could figure this stuff out. It's about how we practice being in community with one another. And being in community is about actually something like this. It's about sharing one's own vulnerability, one's own capacity, one's own limitations and bugaboos, so to speak, in a relationship with another person who can do the same with you. When we think about community as like a noun, we're actually falling into the same trap that the fascists would want us to fall into, right? The intolerances breed on. If we can think about community actually as a verb, as an action, as an opportunity to share with one another, then we're starting to reroute our brains in some ways that actually allows the practices that we inhabit today to be different from the practices that we inhabited in the past. So it's not really a computational problem. It's not about knowing something different. It's about doing something different. So thank you all for being here and participating in the doing of something different with me. I appreciate it.